was angry about that lack of knowledge and that lack of awareness. And so I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to change it. So often the kids will say, I knew it. I know I knew it. I spelt it right. Why can't I remember it? And the frustration that creates for them is huge. The idea's there, but they just don't know how to even get started. And if I don't know about dyslexia, how are parents and teachers meant to know about it? We thought this diagnostic assessment and this diagnostic report was going to be the answer and we'd be able to take it into school and they'd know what to do. And they don't.
Welcome to the Dear Dyslexic Podcast, where lived experience meets real conversation. We shine a light on the stories that need to be heard with honest and inspiring conversations with people with dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions like dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD and autism. The Dear Dyslexic Podcast is more than just a show. It's a community, a space for connection and a movement to rethink dyslexia. Subscribe today and join us on our journey, one story at a time. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Dear Dyslexic Podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to be talking to Elise Cassidy from Little Voices, who is a speech pathologist as well. So I'm really excited to have another speechy on to talk about dyslexia because we often don't unpack what it actually is. We're so busy looking at for adults how we support, and sometimes I think we forget to give a good explanation of what dyslexia is. So it's great to have Elise on the show today to unpack with me a little bit more about dyslexia, the role of the speech pathologist, because again, most people don't understand that speech pathologists are a really integral part in supporting those with dyslexia, particularly when they're children. And also today we're going to touch on diagnosis because we know how challenging it is to get a diagnosis. And in my book, I wrote about those challenges around costs and pathways and knowing even where to get assessed. And so Elise and I are going to unpack a little bit of that today. So welcome to the show, Elise.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
So you are original founder of Code Read Network, and you have a huge passion for dyslexia from what we've been talking about. So where did that passion come from and that idea about Code Read Network?
Yeah, so it sort of started for me. I mean, I've been working as a speech pathologist in the area of literacy for the majority of my career, which is about 30 years now. And I've always had a real interest in, how children learn how to read. That's always been something that's really interested me. But it wasn't until about 10 or 12 years ago that I really started to investigate what dyslexia actually was. And when I first started learning about dyslexia, I thought, how have I been working with these kids with literacy difficulties for so long, and yet I've not really known anything about dyslexia? Like, how is that possible? So when I started investigating more about dyslexia and realized that, yes, probably the majority of the kids that I've been working with all these years would have had dyslexia and I didn't know it, that kind of, it made me actually really angry because I thought, if I don't know it and I'm the specialist who the teachers are referring to to support them with teaching these kids how to read and figuring out where the difficulties are stemming from, why are they struggling with learning to read? And if I don't know about dyslexia, how are parents and teachers meant to know about it? So I guess that sort of put a fire up me because I was angry about it. I was angry about that lack of knowledge and that lack of awareness. And so I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to change it. And it's that sort of guilt of having worked with, and teachers I know feel it all the time, when you don't know what you don't know. And it's so frustrating. And that guilt of having worked with these kids and not been teaching them the right way because I didn't know what I didn't know. And I didn't want that to happen anymore. I wanted to change that. So I then made it my goal to do everything I possibly could to find out more about dyslexia and to work out how I could change that lack of awareness and lack of understanding around it within Australia. So I joined a few different Facebook groups. There'd been some different Facebook support groups start up around the time that I was getting into it, and I linked in with different people through the Facebook groups, and most of them were passionate parents, very passionate parents about really angry as well. We were just all really angry about the state of dyslexia, the lack of knowledge in Australia. And so we said, what can we do? How can we change this? And we got together in 2015 and decided that we were going to be doing something as a nationwide group. And it sort of took a little bit of time. Like, how are we going to do this? Is it going to be a charity? How's it going to come together? And then I actually went over to the UK and I did some postgraduate studies in the UK in dyslexia, which was great because there was nothing like that available in Australia at the time. And while I was over there, that's when Code Red started establishing. And when I came back in 2018, I think it was about 2017 when Code Red really established. And so, we've been doing lots of awareness campaigns. It's very timely because it's Dyslexia Awareness Month at the moment in October. So throughout the country at the moment, there's lots of Light It Red things going on. That started, the first ever one we had of Light It Red for dyslexia was in 2015. And I remember standing at the steps of the State Library in Victoria being lit up red and just thinking, oh my goodness, we've done this. We had a few different places around the country that lit up red in 2015, and every year it's just been getting more and more and more. So it's very exciting now that, many places around the country get lit up red for dyslexia awareness. And it's kind of gone from there. And we've had, many different campaigns. We've had, things like Shift the Shame and Red Letter Day, lots of different things just to try and increase the awareness, the understanding for everyone, for the schools, for teachers, for parents, for people in the workplace, for adults who struggled when they were kids to sort of, look further back and think, is that what it could have been, So, very exciting about how far we've come.
Yeah, and it's great to see, hopefully in time that all of our different organisations can come together to unite, in particular, I think, around Dyslexia Awareness Month, because, I feel sometimes that the dyslexic community is quite fragmented in some ways. And so I think the more we can partner and align, I feel like the autistic community has done such a great job of kind of coming together to help shift the dial, particularly around government thinking and strategy and ministers being placed in like South Australia. I think there's a lot we could learn from the autistic community about how you can bring all that together to kind of have a united voice.
Yeah,
I feel like that's really what's missing for us at the moment. And I think it would have such great power if these teams like yourselves, our organisation, the spelled, we could come together to start to help to have those conversations, because we are the leading neurodivergent difference condition at the moment. The more we can unite, the stronger it'll be, because it's really interesting that you say that you didn't know about dyslexia even though you're working with these students, because when I was trained as a speech pathologist in the 2000s, I didn't know anything about dyslexia.
yeah,
And when I was diagnosed as an adult, I couldn't understand why. As a speech pathologist, I'd never really understood about it.
yeah,
And I think, that was frustrating for me. And I think a lot of people don't understand the role that speech pathologists play in this. So you have much more expertise in this than me around language development and working with children. So for those listening who may not understand why us speeches are so pivotal, particularly in intervention as a child and supporting assessments or during assessments, could you speak a little bit about the fact that we're not just about speech? Because when I say to people, you need to see a speech pathologist, they're like, but there's nothing wrong with how I talk.
yes.
And then I have to unpack why it's really important that we're included. But it'd be great to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah. So, I mean, dyslexia and, learning of literacy really stems from the language system. And, in Australia, we're called speech pathologists, but in the US and the UK, we're called speech language pathologists or therapists. So I think it's really important to have that language component in our name. But really, we're communication specialists. So by calling us speech pathologists, it is a very narrow term, and it does mean that a lot of people don't really understand the scope of our practice. But because we are very much professionals that have expertise in the language, speech and language system, and literacy comes from the language system. And dyslexia itself actually stems from some of the underlying core deficit areas in dyslexia can be related to what we call phonological processing. And phonological essentially means the speech sound system. So the difficulties of dyslexia, where they actually stem from, those underlying core areas of difficulty, stem from difficulties with our speech sound system. So we very much are the people who have that strong underlying knowledge of the speech sound system of language. And really, it's the speech sound system and the connection between the speech sound system and the written system that is one of the main difficulties in dyslexia.
I feel like I'm having some trauma going back to when we were studying phonetics at university, and we'd have to have during the dictionary, and we'd have to look at the little sounds and look at,
Yes.
oh my gosh, as you said, the sounds. Oh my gosh, I'm having flashbacks.
When I was at university, and I was in that university in the mid-90s, early 90s, finished in the mid-90s, there was nothing, literally nothing about literacy whatsoever in my undergraduate degree. Nothing. Everything I've learned has been through work experience. And I know that it's gradually getting better and that there, in many of the undergraduate speech pathology degrees now, there is a lot more in literacy, but I still don't believe there's enough. I still don't believe that people come out of a speech pathology degree having a really strong awareness of how much literacy difficulties are impacted by speech and language. I think that could be improved.
And so if we're thinking, we'll start with children and then we can progress through to adults. But if we're thinking of children, and we'll come back to diagnosis, but what would be, as a speechy, when we send a child to you and we think it's dyslexia, what are the kind of things that parents should know that the speech pathologist would do before we unpack all the other things? We probably have to do this in two parts.
Yeah, it really depends on the age of the child. If the child is very young, and we know that there are a lot of risk factors that we can see even in the very, very early years before a child's even started the formal education and formal teaching of literacy. So, for example, if you've got a child in the preschool years who's not playing around with sounds in words, not picking up nursery rhymes, that's an area known as phonological awareness, and it is one of the core deficit areas in dyslexia. So if they're starting school or in preschool, they're not able to talk about the sounds in words. They're not able to say, play, I spy. So I spy with my little eye something beginning with P. You can do it with sounds or you can do it with letters, P. If they struggle with that, that's in the early years. That can be an indicator. And so if they've got those difficulties, that's the kind of thing that we would be looking at. So we, may do some screening for phonological awareness in the early years and see their knowledge of sounds in words. Can they match words that begin with the same sound? Can they blend sounds together to create words? Can they break words up into their individual sounds? So it's really just a good, strong awareness and understanding of speech sounds in words. Another big risk factor is if they've had speech sound production difficulties as well, articulation difficulties. So many children who have early speech sound production difficulties and that's, I guess, the area that we're most well known for supporting is working with children on their speech sounds. But a lot of children who have a history of speech sound development difficulties do go on to have some literacy difficulties as well. So we can often tell, if we work with a child with speech sound difficulties in the early years, we know that we should be screening for phonological awareness difficulties as well. Also, language difficulties. So we want to see what their vocabulary is like and their sentence structure and their ability to follow instructions and things like that. So that's a lot of what we can be doing with the children in the early years as well.
And so my understanding is generally that we really can start to notice the impact of dyslexia when we start to get into grade 2, when we're putting those sounds together to make words and those words into a sentence and we're having to start to read, where you generally start to see that really show up for children.
Yeah, so that's when the difficulties do become more apparent to, say, the teachers and the parents. we can identify a child with dyslexia 6 months into their first year of school if they've had what is considered to be evidence-based, structured, and explicit teaching. So we can actually identify it. We would want to identify it in the first year of their schooling. But yes, the difficulties often don't become apparent until they actually move from learning to read into reading to learn, which is sort of around the grade 2 to 3 year, when things like, the picture support is reduced, or things like that, when the sentences get longer, the writing gets smaller, those sorts of things. But the earlier we can identify it, obviously, the better.
And so that's probably a really good segue in before we progress into adulthood around early identification, because we always say, even as adults, assessments are so important, and we can break it down. It's so important for children to get assessed because then we can put that early intervention in, and we know early intervention is key to supporting how we progress. And a lot of people we work with haven't had that opportunity, partly because they may not have known, but also we know that it's so expensive to get a dyslexia assessment.
Yes.
And so when I go to talk, I always say it's such a privilege. I was assessed at university at a low cost, but it was a privilege because so many people can't afford to be assessed in the first place. And so we've got this huge cohort of children, young people, adults that are struggling. So at the moment in Australia, the main people would be an educational psychologist, and that would be the general first point of call for anyone wanting to get an assessment. But I feel that there's other options around who else could be assessing. And I'd love to kind of flesh that out with you, knowing that it's so hard to get assessed at the moment. And we're seeing so many improvements in the autism and ADHD space about improving assessing and access. But we're not seeing that with dyslexia at the moment.
Yeah, and that's something that speech pathologists are working very hard to do. So there is a wonderful company of Queensland speech pathologists called Read3, and they have brought out a free, very easily online accessible screening tool that is really wonderful for screening for dyslexia. And so, one of the big points I want to make is that, yes, a full diagnostic assessment, even when done by a speech pathologist, is still very expensive. And while diagnosis we'll probably go into talking about the benefits of a diagnosis, but I think in the early years, in the first 2 years of schooling, what is more important than an actual full diagnostic assessment is to screen. Because regardless of whether you have a diagnosis or not, if the child is struggling with learning to read and spell, then we should be putting intervention in place regardless of whether they've got a diagnosis or not. And so having readily available, easily accessible screening tools, I think, is the most important thing. So for teachers to know that they can screen in the school. And so, the Year 1 phonics check has come out in many states. It's been used in South Australia for a while. It's been used in New South Wales. It's rolling out in Victoria. And that is a wonderful screening tool that teachers are using so that they can identify in the very early years of schooling whether the child has those indicators for dyslexia. So more than anything, that's I think the biggest thing, because we want to make it accessible to every single person, regardless of whether they can afford the full diagnostic assessment or not. Then I guess we go into, the benefits of a diagnosis. And, I think getting the full diagnostic assessment with a psychologist, as you said, that's the traditional pathway to get a full assessment. However, they are very expensive. Like, I run a clinic where we have a lot of children who've already had a dyslexia diagnosis come to our clinic. And so we get the diagnostic report. And I would say something about 80% of the diagnostic reports that we get from psychologists, the psychologists have done 2 assessments. They've done a WISC assessment and they've done a Wyatt assessment. And what that does is give us their cognitive profile, which is not actually relating directly to their literacy difficulties. and they give us the symptoms of their literacy difficulties, but it doesn't go into the underlying core deficit areas. And I believe that's a little bit of an issue because I believe we really do need to investigate the underlying core deficit areas. And it's a very contentious topic, but I don't believe a whisk assessment is needed for a dyslexia diagnosis.
Well, it's interesting you say that because they're saying that as well with ADHD at the moment. And I'll come back to color pairings after, but for us, we use two screening tools for adults that come through our services. And when people come to us and they want to know whether they've got dyslexia, we always give them the two choices. One is they go to a neuropsychologist and they'll do the testing, like you said. And I always say a good neuropsychologist will use the Wilcock and Johnson as an example because that gives a better understanding of the literacy challenges that someone might be having and why. Or they can come through and do our screening tools, which was one that was created in Australia. It's an AI tool that does all the phonological awareness, rapid speed, so your reading speed, your accuracy. And then the other one is a standardized tool from the UK called the Vanguard, which is it's an older screening tool, but it kind of looks a bit more, it doesn't look at the phonics and the language. It's looking at more the other challenges we have. So sequencing, short-term memory, left-right confusion, things like that. And so together we can put those two tools together, which is delivered by our psychologist at the moment, that we're starting to bring speeches into to do it as well. And that report then is a likelihood. And for adults, most of the time, that's all they need to explain what's happened for them. And they don't need that full psychological assessment because it doesn't give us enough. It's not giving us a huge amount of information that we can use day to day.
Yeah.
And we can use that report to then access funding through Job Access to get them the one-on-one support they need to deliver. But that's been life-changing for people to be able to access something that was low cost, that's quite fast, and just explains to them what they already really know or what they've seen in their children or their family already. And so it's a really interesting conversation around the roles that different allied health play and even just the roles of screeners versus an assessment.
Yes.
And some of the controversy that seems to be around just those tools themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's still many, many schools who are saying we need a diagnosis before we can put the support in place. And that shouldn't be the case. They should be putting the support in place without a diagnosis. I do believe that a diagnosis is beneficial, and I believe it should be accessible to everyone. And unfortunately, at the moment, it's not. The ideal situation would be that every school or every area, a district or, area has a dyslexia specialist who can go around and do the screening assessments, do the full diagnostic. I dream of a world where that's the case, where a dyslexia diagnosis and a full dyslexia diagnostic assessment is accessible to everyone regardless. At the moment, it's not. We're probably a fair way from that ever being the case.
And no, I completely agree. And when we have come to us, we will not screen children and we won't screen young people. And we won't screen people if they need to go into university because we don't want them wasting their money when they take that report and then they say, well, no, it's not a full assessment and now you can't access the support they need. And so we're very clear that we won't do that because of the barriers at the moment, which is so unfair because it's such a cheap alternative that could give the same type of answer that's needed. But we know that, at the moment, a full assessment is required. And even going into university, that full assessment is often required. And then for me, I had to go to the GP every year to say I still had dyslexia and dysgraphia. So there's so many systemic barriers put in our way.
Yes.
And then I think we've then got all the professionals arguing. And before we got online, we were talking about just the term dyslexia, trying to explain what it actually is because there's so many variations globally around what the term even means.
Yeah.
That it becomes so hard for the individual, I think, and the noise around it all to know where is the right place to go and who are the right people to help them.
Yes, and what is the right information? There's just so much misinformation online and just an insane amount of information for parents to sift through that they don't know what is real and what is snake oil, and teachers don't know either. So, we find that when the parents who come to us, if they've had a diagnosis, they expected that they're paying $2,500–3,000 for a diagnostic assessment with a psychologist. They're given the report, and yeah, they sit in the session and the information from the report is fed back to them, but they're given this document, and the document, the report, is the one that they think is going to change everything for them. And so then they take that document into the school, and they think the school is going to look at the document, read it, use it, look at the recommendations and put all those recommendations in place. And that just doesn't happen. It's often a document that's hardly ever used. It is quite a complex document. There are often numerous recommendations. And we find that often is the case that the psychologists have conveyed it to the parents, and then the parents are expected to convey it to the school, but they don't have a strong understanding of what it all means. So they struggle to convey it to the school, and the school don't know either. And the parents think the school is going to know, and then they just get lost. And so we have families coming to us just in despair because they're like, we thought this would be the answer. We thought this diagnostic assessment and this diagnostic report was going to be the answer, and we'd be able to take it into school and they'd know what to do. And they don't, and they're lost. And I think I don't know how we change that. That's what I'm trying to change in my practice, is to be that connection between the assessment and the parents and the school, so that it's a usable document. So when we do assessments and we do diagnosis, we have a meeting with the school and we actually very clearly explain how those recommendations can be used for that child. And we also explain the child's specific, in very, obviously a lot of the terminology is complex and tricky, so I try to break it down into terminology that makes a little bit more sense and explain what that actually means for the child, what it means for their learning, and why, if you're seeing a child who, for example, you have been teaching them the spelling of a word and they've seen that word 100 times over, and one day they know it and the next day they don't, or maybe 2 days in a row, 3 days in a row they know it and then it's gone. Explaining why, what is going on in their brain for that to happen. And we explain that to the child as well a lot of the time. I've got little analogies that I use. I use something called the blue tack analogy. So I'll say, things will go into your brain and we'll stick it in there with blue tack. And, it might stick for a couple of days, but then it'll fall out again because the blue tack's not very effective at keeping it stuck in there. So what we want to do is to do it over and over and over, and repetition, this kind of blue tack, repetition turns the blue tack into super glue, so that eventually, after we've repeated it enough times, it will go to this special part in your brain that's like super glue, and it holds onto it, and then it won't fall out anymore. So, little analogies like that help the parents and the teachers and the child themselves to know why these things are happening for them. Because so often the kids will say, I knew it. I knew it. I know I knew it. I spelt it right. Why can't I remember it? And the frustration that creates for them is huge. So if we can explain to them why that's happening for them, it just makes it a lot easier for them to, they just say, that's just the way my brain works. My brain's got blue tack at the moment, but I'm going to work on turning it to super glue. Just making it a bit more user friendly for them.
And so as they progress through and you work through them throughout primary school, because that's part of the challenge too, isn't it, financially, is that you need ongoing support to build that super glue.
Yes.
And I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts around the role of tutors and helping, in between to help with that building of super glue. But as we progress into secondary school and our plasticity isn't as plastic anymore, even though we know our brain changes constantly, but as we get older, it is harder to learn to build our super glue. And so if you haven't had that intervention and you don't get diagnosed until secondary school, and we see there's a big gap with young people coming through the diagnosis, what do you think we can start to do for this cohort as they transition out of primary school into secondary school? And, do you feel that should still be a focus of literacy, or should we be transitioning, because the work we do is really supporting that upper secondary transitioning out. We don't do any literacy work because we feel that there's other things that are going to help us when we're in school.
Yeah.
But it's for that period where we're in school, what are some of the things that you think can be really helpful if literacy support starts to wane off?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few different things, and it really does depend. As people get older, and particularly towards the end of their secondary schooling, I think that's very much up to the individual. If we have someone who says, I haven't learned how to read, that really frustrates me, and I'd really like to learn how to read better, then that motivation comes from them. And we will definitely be able to support them in learning how to read, as well as providing them with opportunities to practice using assistive technology. So, the further they get into their secondary schooling, the more important use of assistive technology is going to be, and the accommodations that they get in their classroom and things like that. So, if they're ever having to do any learning about content, about vocabulary, information, whatever it might be, they should never be asked to read in order to learn. So they should have access to assistive technology to help with that. So text to speech kind of things. And it's the same in terms of them demonstrating their knowledge and understanding on something. They should never be asked to demonstrate that knowledge through writing. It should be through speech to text, unless that's something that's discussed with the individual themselves as well. So, for example, I have a student who has dysarthria, which means that she doesn't have very clear speech. So her using speech to text is not particularly effective. So we've worked on her touch typing speed, and we've worked on using assistive technology that is a word prediction and her orthographic processing so that she can recognize when words are spelt, the word that she's looking for is there. So it's, different things depending on the individual's needs, but assistive technology is usually something that we will work quite a bit with. And I start working on assistive technology with my kids from the end of primary school, because it isn't initially something that, a lot of people feel a little bit of they may feel some stigma associated with it. They may feel it's a bit clunky and difficult to use. But like with anything, the more practice they have at using it, the more experience they have at using it, the more comfortable and confident they get at using it, the more effective it is. So the earlier we can introduce that, the more effective it will be when they come to actually really needing to use it in secondary school. But like you were saying, what is that balance of actually teaching them to read and giving them access to this assistive technology? I think that really comes down to the individual and their motivation to want to learn to read.
It's interesting because when we were at university, we learned about AOC, augmentative
Yeah.
alternative communication.
Yeah.
And really for, I think, dyslexics, instead of AAC, we're really looking at AI and assistive technology in a different way, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's so much now, and it's just going to get more and more and more. I don't read books anymore. I use an audiobook now, so there are just so many things now at our fingertips. I wrote a blog post only like 18 months ago about when Copilot first came out and how it was going to be a game changer for people with dyslexia because to, reduce the amount of time spent doing research. But now that's on Google. When you ask a question, you no longer have to go through website after website after website to find the information, because that was always something for my secondary kids, when they're researching. It was such a cognitively exhausting task for them because they can't scan. So when you get your Google search and you've got all these different websites where that information might be. They used to have to scan through the websites to find the information that was relevant to them. But now Google's got that AI at the front and they don't need to do that anymore. So, you think about the way that AI is changing so much all the time. I can only imagine in the future that's just going to be easier and easier.
Yes, I always say I can work independently now, and I rarely get anything proof checked unless it's really, really important. I'll get my auntie or someone to proof check it for me. But AI has just changed my life from Google Maps to Copilot and ChatGPT. it's phenomenal. And so how fast it's happening as well. And that's a lot of the work that we do with adults. But I wanted to come back to co-occurring difficulties because we're starting to see more and more that it would be uncommon to have more than one neurodivergent difference. So how do you think as a speechy we can support those? I mean, do a lot of work with children all the way through to adults with autism. Like that's always been one of the core things we've been really trained in. But we're seeing more and more ADHD come in with dyslexia now. So are you seeing this a lot in your practice? And are there things that you think families and young people and hopefully speeches and allied health that may listen to this conversation that we can be doing more to support that executive functioning? Because I don't think executive functioning is spoken a lot about with dyslexia apart from our working memory. And I really feel like it's a lot more than just our working memory that's affected.
Yes, hugely. Yeah. I mean, my work with the secondary school kids, there's a lot that we do in terms of executive functioning, especially, it's really interesting for those kids that had the right kind of literacy support right from the very beginning of their schooling. It really is that executive functioning that then tends to impact them more in their later years. They become quite successful readers. They may read slowly, so their fluency isn't great, but they've reached the ultimate goal of learning to read is understanding what you're reading. And many of them, if they've had the right support in the early years, do reach that. And so what I'm seeing with a lot of these kids now is that it is that executive functioning, and it impacts so many areas for them in terms of their secondary schooling, in terms of organizational skills and planning. Executive functioning skills are so important in, say, a written planning, an essay or something like that. And they get so stuck, the idea's there, but they just don't know how to even get started. So task initiation and planning and organizational skills. So we do a lot of work around that in terms of giving them visual planners, color coding things, and really what works for an individual is very individual. What works for one person may not work for another. So we sort of present them with different graphic organizers or planners or whatever it might be, different color coding things, and give them options of, let's see how this works for you and if this works for you. And if not, then, we've got different things that we can present them with. But absolutely, those executive functioning skills in the secondary years and onwards become more, I think, than the literacy skills.
And so staying on the co-occurring, because I have dysgraphia, for those listening, we would still send someone, a child or a young person, to see a speech if they've got dysgraphia to help with their written expression skills and to support with that. And what about dyscalculia? I really struggle to find any specialists that can support, and there's such a lack of information, even though we know that they all sit under the learning difficulties umbrella. And I think there's a lot of stuff that's happened with dyspraxia. So I'm not really going to touch on that, but it's just more, the dyslexia, the dyscalculia and the dysgraphia.
Yes.
Like, where do you go for the dyscalculia?
That is a really
You
that's
have an answer.
so, there are, so in Melbourne, for example, the Melbourne University Clinic has a dyscalculia clinic, and there are little places here and there. So again, in Melbourne, I used to work at a place called the Dyslexia Hub, and there are teachers, special education teachers there who work in dyscalculia. As speech pathologists, I don't. I don't have anything to do with dyscalculia, but yeah, I would say special education teachers are the ones who focus more on that. And hopefully, coming out of the dyscalculia clinic in Melbourne University, there might be more specialists around, I'm hoping. But yeah, that is definitely an area that there's not enough awareness at all.
So with dysgraphia, I mean, I feel like learning difficulties are the poor cousin to autism and ADHD, fitting under that neurodivergent umbrella. And then I feel like dyslexia is the leading cousin under the learning difficulties. And then it gets sparser and sparser. Like I was running training for the vet sector this week, and I had all these slides on dyslexia. Then I started to have slides on dyscalculia because there's actually some great resources out of the UK. And then it got to like dysgraphia, and there was one slide, and there was I only had one slide for dyspraxia because it's not the only area that I work with. But it was like, I have dysgraphia, and that impacts me the most. My
Right.
dyslexia and dysgraphia. I can read quite well. My reading is slow, and my letters deflect, so my B's and D's deflect. But my spelling is not great, but it's my dysgraphia. So I miss E's and D's of words. My tenses are always confused. I get past the present mixed up, where and where. And I tend to write, if you think about like an introduction, the middle and the conclusion, I write the middle part first. So I
Mm,
get to put the context in about why are we talking about that. So if I
mm,
send an email, like I've trained and trained myself, one, to make it sound polite because I've always missed the pleasantries. I've always just got to the point.
mhm.
So I always write, I hope you're well. Doesn't matter what it is. I've just trained myself to make sure I put that in.
Start that way. Yeah.
Yeah, start that way. But I still tend to, I just put the point and then I forget that I have to put the context in. And I mean, AI helps,
Yes.
significantly. But that was always a real challenge for me. And so for me, it's always been my writing that's had a significant impact.
And there's a lot of executive functioning in that too. Like it's a both things are playing together there, I think. The writing and the structuring of the ideas, but also the executive functioning in terms of planning and sequencing.
Well, I've just recently found out of that ADHD, so that probably plays
Plan.
into it
Yes.
now as well. So it all becomes, and it was funny because when I was getting assessed for ADHD, it's like, that sounds like you've got a bit of dyslexia, the way you're describing how you grew up. And I was like, possibly, but I don't need another way. I said, I'll just stick to these ones for now. I have no sense of spatial depth or anything. But with someone's coming and their child has been diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia, because they do it again childcare, from a speech perspective, what would you be supporting a child or a young person in this clinical setting? It sounds very clinical. When they come to see you.
Yeah. So if I've got a couple, not many, but I have had a couple with just a dysgraphia diagnosis. If it's a dyslexia and dysgraphia, I look at what the underlying core deficit areas are. So depending on how those underlying core deficit areas are playing will be the program that I pick up and use and adapt depending on the child's individual strengths and weaknesses. But if it's just dysgraphia, and again, it really does depend on what their specific areas of difficulty within dysgraphia are. So, for example, if you were mentioning you often get your verb tenses mixed up or leave your word endings off. So, in that case, I would work often with a child in an area known as morphology. And morphology is the smallest units of the language with meaning. So, for example, word endings, prefixes, suffixes, those sorts of things. So, we work explicitly on teaching what does ed mean as a suffix, meaning past tense. And then we work on the spelling rules of adding suffixes, spelling rules. So we explicitly teach the individual parts of language as opposed to if we were working more with a child with dyslexia, we'd work on the phonological awareness, which is the speech sound part. With someone with dysgraphia, we'd do less of the speech sounds and work more on the parts of words. So prefixes, suffixes, base words, those sorts of things.
And then you're talking about the rules because no matter how many times I say I before C, except after E, I still can never write
Yes. And, there are some rules that we all grew up with that actually aren't they only work for a small percentage of words. They're not actually that useful because they don't apply to a huge number. So it is about, some children with difficulty with cognitive load, they can't take on too much information. I wouldn't be giving them too many rules because I know that that would confuse them too much. So again, it's really looking at the child's individual profile and their strengths and weaknesses and knowing what would benefit them the most. For some children, they really rely on spelling rules. When I work with a child who is really good at picking up the spelling rules, and so, for example, if they're good with spelling rules and they're very good at recognizing when a word looks right, and that's another thing that I'll assess early on. I'll see what is their orthographic processing like, and that's the processing of the written system of language, can they recognize when a word is spelt correctly, but not actually know how to spell it correctly themselves? So I give them then the tools because I know that once they get to the one that is correct, they'll know that's correct. So, there's different things that we do depending on what their strengths and weaknesses are. But yes, someone with dysgraphia, we're more likely to use the spelling rules because they are more likely to remember those.
Which is interesting because if you've got working memory challenges, then the memory of the spelling rules until you can get them into your long-term memory, it's really hard, isn't it?
And it depends. Like I said, if they've got working memory, then probably not.
Well, I think to bring it all back, and it's really great to be able to talk about the fundamentals of dyslexia and dysgraphia, knowing that we can't do a lot with dyscalculia and we need to find some specialists that can, and dyspraxia is well looked after with OTs and speech as well.
Yeah.
But there is a huge amount of research into dyspraxia. I think it comes back to the importance of what you're talking about accessing and assessment and and early intervention. And I hope in time, like we're both trying to do, is that screening or different ways of assessing becomes more readily accepted in Australia, because we know that it's accepted overseas in many other countries. Lots of people, I mean, in the UK, they have workplace assessors that do language screening for dyslexia. There's so many things I think we can draw from and learn from other countries, and stop being so protective of our patch.
Yeah, because I think, and again, I'm going to go to my ideal dream world. My ideal dream world is a place where everyone has access to a multidisciplinary approach to the diagnosis because we all bring our individual things. However, I feel in Australia at the moment that it really is the area of educational psychologists, and that what we as speech pathologists bring to the process isn't acknowledged and understood enough. And we really do bring a huge amount to the diagnostic process. And I would like that to be more understood and acknowledged.
And we're the ones doing the intervention.
Yes.
So if we're doing the intervention and the support, then we should be doing the assessing like that.
Exactly. And then we know what recommendations. I think when I get a report from a speech pathologist compared to an educational psychologist, the recommendations are different because we're the ones who are performing the intervention. So we know what to recommend and we understand the phonics programs. We know what they mean and what the strengths and weaknesses and how they relate to that child's specific strengths and weaknesses as well. Whereas a lot of educational psychologists don't have as much knowledge on the specific programs that are out there and being used.
Well, I think, again, ADHD, since the Senate inquiry, is really leading the way in how different professionals can start to step in and support. And we're seeing that with GPs now being able to assess in New South Wales and potentially now in South Australia. And, again, I think that we have a lot to learn from those other neurodivergent conditions and how we can start to make things more accessible and share the load, because the load is huge. The wait lists are long, the costs are long. That's why they're doing it with ADHD. The wait lists are blown out. Psychiatrists don't have the capacity. And I think, there needs to really be some reform and some support around language and assessments and screening, because, like you say, an multidisciplinary team is so important, whether it's children or adults, and helping the adults is a lot more around mental health and the links with their neurodivergence and mental psychology. But I think, we're starting to see it in other areas, and so I really hope that we can follow. And I really hope that this podcast starts to shine a light on the role that we play as speech pathologists, whether it's children or adults, in supporting dyslexia and other learning difficulties. So I really, really appreciated you coming on today to help us demystify some of the questions around dyslexia. And I think it's really important to kind of set the scene from childhood and then how that, progresses and can impact into adulthood when they don't have that important support.
Yes, absolutely. 100%. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, and it'd be great to have you on again. I've learned so much, getting a refresher back in the basics of dyslexia, because sometimes we get so caught up in how to support, and I forget to explain to people what it actually means, which now I have diagrams to help me. but it's always really helpful to unpack it with another species. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you everyone for listening, and you can find out more about Elise and Little Voices and the work she's doing, particularly around supporting young people in secondary schools as well. So we'll share all of those resources, and we look forward to talking to you next time. So thanks for listening. Bye for now.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.